Picture this. You're 13 years old, lying on your bedroom floor, headphones in, watching a stranger on a laptop screen explain exactly how you feel about something you've never been able to put into words. And it hits you harder than any conversation you've had with any adult in your life. That wasn't a bug in your development. That was your brain doing exactly what it was built to do. Welcome to the psychology of Generation Z, the cohort born between 1997 and 2012. The generation that's been called distracted, anxious, fragile, and addicted to screens before most of you were even old enough to vote. The generation that older commentators can't seem to stop diagnosing. Here's what nobody tells you. A lot of what looks like dysfunction is actually adaptation. And the science behind how Gen Z brains developed is far more interesting than another think piece about TikTok ruining attention spans. Let's actually get into it. First, you have to understand the baseline condition Gen Z developed in. Every generation has an environment that shapes the architecture of their brains during critical development windows. Childhood and adolescence, when neural pathways are still being carved out, when the brain is essentially deciding what kind of world it's preparing for. For boomers, it was post-war abundance and the Cold War's background radiation of existential threat. For millennials, it was 9/11, economic collapse, and the wild early internet. For Gen Z, it was something different entirely. You were the first generation to go through adolescence with a supercomputer in your pocket, and the entire internet's worth of human experience accessible before you'd fully formed a prefrontal cortex. That's not a small thing. That's a fundamentally different developmental context than any generation before you. And here's where it gets fascinating, because your brain responded. The dopamine architecture Gen Z brains were shaped in what neuroscientists are now calling a high-velocity dopamine environment. Dopamine, if you're not familiar, is the neurotransmitter your brain releases in anticipation of reward. It's not actually the pleasure chemical. That's a common misconception. Dopamine is more accurately the what's next chemical. It fires when you expect something good might be coming. Now imagine developing your dopamine system in an environment where reward arrived constantly, unpredictably, and immediately. Scroll, dopamine. Notification, dopamine. A video that made you laugh, dopamine. New comment, dopamine. Researchers at UCLA's Amundsen Lovelace Brain Mapping Center have documented that adolescents who develop in high-stimulation digital environments show measurably different reward circuit sensitivity than previous generations. What does that look like in practice? You get bored faster with low-stimulation tasks. You need more novelty to feel engaged. You can context switch between multiple streams of information in ways that genuinely seem superhuman to someone who grew up reading one newspaper. Society frames this as an attention problem, but there's another frame. And it's a more accurate one. You're not broken. Your filtering system is calibrated differently, and in an information-saturated world, the ability to process multiple inputs and rapidly sort signal from noise isn't a liability. It's a survival skill. The anxiety paradox. Let's talk about the mental health data, because it's real and it matters, and we're not going to pretend it isn't there. Studies published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology found significant increases in major depression and anxiety disorders among adolescents between 2005 and 2017. Increases concentrated almost entirely in the post-2012 period, which tracks with widespread smartphone adoption. Gen Z reports higher rates of anxiety and depression than any previous generation at the same age. That's not nothing. And dismissing it as kids these days is both intellectually lazy and genuinely harmful. But here's what's interesting about it. Gen Z is also the most psychologically literate generation in history. The same young people who score higher on anxiety scales are also dramatically more likely to name their emotions accurately, seek therapy, set boundaries, and talk openly about mental health in ways that previous generations would have died before admitting to. There's a concept in clinical psychology called metacognitive awareness, the ability to think about your own thinking, to observe your emotional states from a slight distance rather than just being swept away by them. Research from Harvard's Center on the Developing Child suggests that developing metacognitive skills early, even in high-stress environments, leads to better long-term emotional regulation outcomes. Gen Z didn't just develop anxiety. They developed a language for it, a framework for discussing it, a community around processing it, and that's something no previous generation had the tools to do. You didn't become fragile. You became fluent in something your parents couldn't even name, the identity complexity. Here's something older generations genuinely struggle to understand. Gen Z grew up with access to an almost infinite library of identity options. You could, at 15, find a subreddit a Discord server, a TikTok subculture, a YouTube niche that mapped onto exactly who you were, not who your geography or your family or your school expected you to be. Erik Erikson, the developmental psychologist who basically invented the modern theory of identity formation, described adolescence as the stage where individuals go through what he called an identity moratorium, a period of active exploration where you try on different versions of yourself before committing to a stable sense of who you are. He theorized this in the 1950s, when the available identities were what your parents were, what your town expected, or rebel. Gen Z ran. Erikson's identity moratorium on a server with unlimited processing power. The knock on this is that it creates instability, confusion, anxiety about who you really are. And yes, access to infinite identity options without solid developmental scaffolding can do that, but the other side of it is nuance, complexity, a resistance to reductive either slash or thinking that genuinely distinguishes Gen Z from older cohorts in measurable ways. A 2019 Pew Research study found Gen Z significantly more likely than older generations to know someone who uses gender-neutral pronouns, to see racial identity as a spectrum, to hold views on religion, politics, and personal identity that don't fit neatly into legacy categories. That's not confusion. That's a more sophisticated operating system for navigating a world that is, in fact, more complicated than binary choices allow for. The connection paradox. Gen Z is the loneliest generation by some metrics. Surgeon General advisories, multiple longitudinal. Studies from Harvard, data from the American Psychological Association, all of it points in the same direction. Young people today report fewer close friendships, less face-to-face time, higher rates of social isolation than any generation before them. And at the same time, Gen Z invented a form of intimacy that has no real historical precedent, the parasocial relationship. The deep, one-sided connection you feel with a creator, a streamer, a podcaster, a character on a show. Research from the journal Communication Theory has found that parasocial relationships activate the same neural pathways as real social bonds. Your brain doesn't fully distinguish between a close friend and someone whose voice you've heard for hundreds of hours. The fluency nobody credits. There's one more thing. Gen Z is the most media literate generation in history, and almost nobody gives you credit for it. You grew up in an information ecosystem designed to manipulate you at a neurological level. Algorithms optimized for engagement, influencer marketing indistinguishable from organic content, political advertising disguised as memes, deepfakes, misinformation scaled by automation. I'm not saying one generation is better than another. That's not what this is. Every generation has its scars and its superpowers, and the line between them is usually the same trait viewed from two different angles. But I am saying that the story of Gen Z as a damaged, fragile, distracted generation that broke from too much screen time is a deeply incomplete story. It's the story of a generation that developed in a genuinely unprecedented environment and adapted to it in genuinely unprecedented ways. Ways that are still being mapped, still being understood, still being underestimated. The generation that was told it couldn't handle hard things is also the generation that normalized therapy, built global movements at 18, processed collective trauma in public, and built communities around the exact specific ways they experience being human. That's not a broken generation. That's a generation that grew up faster, in harder conditions, with better tools for knowing themselves, and decided to actually use them. If you made it to the end of this video, you already know which category you're in.